In yet another slap in the face of British people, it was revealed this week the government has indeed decided to use private companies to sweep up housing across the country to house thousands of illegal migrants. It won't come as any surprise to you that the migrants won't be paying a penny, of course, despite spending thousands to get here. Instead, according to reports, they're getting a golden ticket. 5 years of guaranteed rent, paid for by you, the taxpayer, to house asylum seekers, while locals scramble for homes. Private companies working for the government are promising landlords that all maintenance, repairs, bills and property management will also be covered as part of the deal to house these illegal migrants. Meanwhile, a whole generation of people in this country are suffering the highest cost of living in memory. House prices are through the roof, bills are up extortionate amounts, and rents are pricing locals out of their own towns. That's without even mentioning our homeless veterans living on the streets and people who've hit hard times. Many of them told they are not a priority for housing. Frankly, it makes me feel sick, and I'm sure it does many of you at home. Once again, British people are last and illegals are first. The constant betrayal of British people will not be forgotten, though, will it? A reckoning is coming. I say, start the deportations now and put British people to the front of the queue. Well, Renee, this is quite a shocking story, isn't it? As if we hadn't had enough with the hotels and everything else in this country, now British taxpayers are going to be housing illegals while they can't even get homes themselves.
I think this is really interesting, this decision, because obviously it's designed to massage the figures so that hotel numbers will go down and people will think that we're winning in this battle. But actually, we've already seen a deluge of landlords, and I am one of them, who have sold their single flats or houses since this government came into power because it was already hard enough to get rid of errant tenants who are smashing the place up. Took me 20 months without rent, by the way. And so already the market has got smaller because of the Labour approach to the Renters' Rights Bill. And now this is going to further deplete the renters' market and increase rents. Everything for British people that should be happening isn't happening.
Matthew, of course, you know, the government would argue this is cheaper than hotels, but many taxpayers are going to be sitting there saying, why am I still paying for this crisis? Labour promised they'd get it under control when actually the numbers are going up.
So, first of all, you're right, and it's not just a government argument. It is cheaper than hotels, so it could be as little as £14 a night per person, rather than around, or as much as, or maybe, I'm not exactly sure whether it could be even more, but £140 per night for hotels. Secondly, there is a duty of due process in this country. That's one of the reasons people want to come to this country. It's one of the reasons I'm proud to be British. We have the rule of law, and that means that if people come here, you call them illegals, they are asylum seekers.
Well, they have come here illegally.
They are asylum seekers and they have to have their claims processed. The government would argue that it is speeding up that process, which is obviously important because people who have no right to be here should indeed be deported. It's very easy when there's a cost of living crisis, and there absolutely is, and tens of millions of people in this country are struggling with the cost of living. Many of the people watching this programme, maybe some of us, to point the finger at others. The cost of living crisis, it's got nothing to do with people who are trying to get into this country. It may surprise you, by the way.
Well, hang on. Let me just challenge you on that, Matthew, because if we're spending billions and billions of taxpayers' money to house, hotel, accommodate, benefits, everything else, then surely that's going to have an impact on the tax system in the country, which therefore is passed to consumers who are facing higher cost of living. So I would challenge your argument on that.
If the boat stopped tomorrow, there would still be a cost of living crisis.
But it wouldn't be as bad, surely.
No, I'm not saying the cost is nothing. It may surprise you. Talk about Brits being pushed to the back of the queue. In 2022, there were more than 1 million empty homes in England alone. So the idea that there is some sort of scramble and that Brits are being pushed to the back of the queue, I think is highly debatable at the very least.
OK, Will?
Of course, it has something to do with the cost of living crisis because we don't have infinite amounts of money. So you need to make decisions on where you spend your money, and you can either spend it on British citizens or foreign citizens. The second thing is these may be cheaper than hotels, but they're also more expensive than a detention centre. And this is the big problem in this debate, is unfortunately at the moment what we're doing is we continue to provide incentives for people to come. And what that does is it encourages more people to risk their lives at sea. And what I keep saying, and I've said it on this show before, is the compassionate argument is to have detention centres where you create a disincentive to risk your life at sea. And we're not doing it. The right has the compassionate side of this debate. They're not taking that at the moment.
It's also, I think, that there's the point that never, I mean, it never really gets made in explicit terms is for all of the left to talk about compassion, they've got absolutely no compassion for British people, for people who are already here struggling to get on the housing ladder, for people who are already here who are homeless. I mean, we've seen just this week people sleeping rough directly opposite a migrant facility. So if the government are coming in and they're buying up housing stock with the specific intent to use that housing stock to house migrants at a time when there are not enough homes for British people, livable homes, regardless of whether they're empty or not, that is unjust. It's morally wrong.
I mean, this argument about 1 million empty homes, Matthew, of course you're right, but those homes are owned by people who have invested their money that they've earned into a home. What they do with it in my book is their business. But that aside, we have a critical housing issue. I have a young man who's my patient who is severely ill mentally, and he's severely ill, who is being housed 4 boroughs away from his parents and his family because he's a young man and they can't house him in my borough. I have mothers living in multiple occupancy houses where they're scared to go and use the kitchen. You know, these are people who should be at the front of the queue, but they won't be because there aren't the houses there.
I'm just disputing that there's a competition between the people who, as you say, have genuine need and the people who are trying to get into this country, some of them genuine asylum seekers, many of them, maybe roughly half genuine asylum seekers who also have genuine need. The idea that the right is compassionate on this, I mean, I was debating someone very recently on GBNews, a former UKIPper, I think, a former UKIP politician, who was saying that people were waltzing across the channel. You've just explained how incredibly dangerous it is. People are only risking their lives because they are desperate to get here. We need to treat them with humanity.
OK.
It doesn't matter that they have any right to.
Sorry, guys, sorry. I've got to read this right reply here from the Home Office. These arrangements with private rent in the private rented sector have been in place for years, including under the previous government. We have a statutory duty to support destitute asylum seekers who will not be able to pay for fees such as utilities and council tax. OK, moving on. Matthew, you are up next.
Yeah, my argument is simple. I'm not a Catholic myself. You don't need to be a Catholic to have been impressed by much of what the late Pope Francis achieved in his 12 years, I think it was, as the head of the Roman Catholic Church. I was actually confirmed as an Anglican Christian before I lost my faith. But what the Pope preaches in his very approachable way, he wanted to spend time with ordinary people like us, is that we should be compassionate. And he clearly had an enormous amount of compassion himself. He was the opposite of a grand pope, a pompous pope. And my argument is simple. All of us, and that includes the right, have an enormous amount to learn from him. And what I see sometimes in some sections of the right in this country, and I think in America as well, is the misuse of Christianity to justify the things that are opposite to compassion. You see the vilification of immigrants, whether they're here legally or illegally, the toxicity surrounding them, the toxicity surrounding the trans debate as well. And I think, actually, as someone who was confirmed of my own free will, I wasn't christened as a baby, I came to Christianity of my own accord, I understand that the tenets of Christianity are incredibly powerful. And even if you leave the God bit out, and of course to tens of millions, maybe 1.5 billion in the case of Roman Catholics, the God bit is a lot more than a bit. But even if you leave the God dimension out of it, if we were all to live our lives according to the core tenets of the Christian faith, we would be a much kinder and better society. In other words, just to finish, love thy neighbour, do to others as you would have them do to you.
OK, thank you. Emma?
Well, I'm loath to get into a theological debate with Matthew Stadlen on the implications of a person's personal theology, on their political opinions. But I would say, I mean, Pope Francis had a very big heart. And one cardinal has pointed out this week, or he's said that in looking forward to what sort of pope that we might see next, that it would be an ideal to have all of the characteristics combined of John Paul II's missionary spirit, of Pope Francis's enormous heart and Benedict's theological rigour, and I'm sure that Matthew Stadlen would disagree enormously with Pope Benedict. But I do think, you know, it's not an issue of right or left to have that kind of humility and that kind of enormous heart.
Yeah, I mean, do you think this whole the Catholic? I mean, we say it's not political, don't we? We often say, oh, there's nothing political about religion, but there is, isn't there? Really, Will?
Well, there was under the Pope. That's the thing. It comes down to what we think we mean by compassionate. And if you think you mean following the scriptures, then I would say that is compassionate in the eyes of a Christian. But he went beyond that and did what so many people on the left these days do, which is associate compassion with progressive woke ideology. And a lot of people in the church were incredibly frustrated when he took on the climate change agenda, when he took on a lot of other highly political crusades, which went well beyond the teachings of Christ. And I think that's something which was divisive. It wasn't something which brought people together. So as much as you can, I would say, in a position like this, and this goes to who they will elect next, when you say compassion in the eyes of Christ, not compassion in the eyes of the progressive liberal establishment.
Yeah, Renee, I mean, he was laid to rest today, of course. So we remember all the good things and, he obviously was a man at the end of the day, was he not?
Yes, he was a man, and I think he was. I think he was actually a very compassionate man. I agree, and I think there are, of course, lessons that we can learn by it. But that goes to both things. So when you talk about, for example, as you say, climate change and trans activists, the violence against women that we have seen from the luxury position of those saying that they support trans, they have a lot to learn from Pope Francis too. That's all I'm going to say.
There's been viciousness, as we all know, if we're honest.
Well, we'll come to that.
There's been viciousness on both sides of the trans debate. There are plenty of misogynists, women haters, sexists who support the trans movement, as it were, if we're being really simplistic in our terminology, and plenty of misogynists on the other side who use women in this studio as a fig leaf for their bigotry and their hatred.
But I mean,
misogynistic to describe me as a fig leaf.
I want to bring it back. Let's bring it back to the point, because I think, listen, I mean, at the end of the day, whether you disagreed with him or agreed with him, he is the figurehead of the Catholic Church, is he not? And what he says has an impact on the way Christians view and take action in their own lives.
Yeah, and I think there's a theological point to be made about this too, because, popes are also human beings. The Pope is just a man, but he also has the authority that goes all the way back to St. Peter. So there's an element of divine providence acting within the institution of the church, within the role of the Pope. And it might be that, on some things we don't necessarily agree with him, but, the law works in mysterious ways, and we don't, we had Benedict before him. So, I think, obviously, I would prefer to see somebody who is a bit more traditional, but I'm not going to say anything unpleasant about this Pope on the day of his funeral.
That will be really interesting, right? Because I think that will give us a light into how captured the Catholic Church is as a whole. Will they go for another progressive, or will they go for a more socially conservative Pope? And I think that will... Go on.
Well, no, it's actually very interesting because, I mean, the chances of us getting another progressive Pope is very high. But what's interesting is that younger people tend to prefer the more traditionalist forms of worship, and actually those forms of worship that were very much marginalised by Pope Francis, for example, banning the traditional Latin Mass. So that's actually what young people want, but the chances of getting a progressive Pope is actually quite high.
There's record amounts of young people converting to Christianity at the moment. I think you were talking about this not that long ago, Emma. What is it you think young people want to see exactly?
Seriousness.
Be explicit, because we've got to, what are conservative values in Christianity?
Well, I think in the most fundamental way, the reason why young people are being drawn to more traditional forms of worship, whether it's Pentecostalism, Catholicism, or Catholic forms of Anglicanism, where the congregations are growing in Anglo-Catholicism, it's because young people are attracted to the seriousness. They're attracted to those within the church who preach the gospel as truth. They're not saying, all truths are equal. There's no relativism there. There's no woolliness. They are teaching it without cringing, without being shy or in any way embarrassed by saying that this is the truth. And they're looking for some structure in their lives. And I think the reason why people are attracted to it is because they are surrounded by so much radical untruth of things like trans activism and all of the progressive movements. And it makes Christianity more appealing because it is true. And so actually, theologically, it's not really about conservatism in the political sense. It's about people being attracted to those fundamental things, those that are fundamental to our culture in the West, the basis of Western civilization, and people are hungry for it.
OK, well, that's that.